The Jonestown Massacre left nearly 1,000 people dead, but it was a horrific scene afterwards that many people will never be able to forget. Jim Jones started the People's Temple in Indiana in 1954. Back then, his mission was to preach racial equality, but by 1965, when he moved the temple to the Bay Area, Jones had declared himself God's prophet and was obsessed with the nuclear war he, as a prophet, saw coming.
Some people see a great deal of God in my body. They see Christ in me, a hope of glory.
Jones's delusions grew, as did his congregation, and by 1974 he'd leased land in Guyana with the intention of creating a utopian community far from the US. He called it Jonestown and sold the idea to his flock as an escape from persecution and enslavement.
Where we wouldn't have to pay rent, all the food we needed, our medical would all be taken care of.
It was an escape, all right. Jones and hundreds of his followers disappeared seemingly overnight, just as a number of former congregants began talking to the media about Jones's less than stellar behavior. Their stories included incidents of coercion and control, drug use, sexual abuse, and off-the-charts paranoia. Life in the jungle only fed into Jones's delusions and bad behavior. Only now he was basically the ruler of a small country of his own creation, far from society's prying eyes. Jones used every technique in the book to bend church members to his will, including psychological conditioning, brainwashing, through humiliation, starvation, and more. He even conducted suicide drills.
He called it a white knight, revolutionary suicide.
Then, on November 14, 1978, concerned Congressman Leo J. Ryan left on an official fact-finding visit to the commune. For Jones, this was the last straw. Ryan and 4 others were murdered at an airstrip by a People's Temple death squad, and later that day, the suicide rehearsal became real. It was 2 days before first responders arrived to recover and identify the bodies. In the meantime, the corpses had been left in the open, exposed to jungle heat and humidity. You'd expect vultures and other scavengers to feed on the remains, but they didn't, possibly because most of the victims died by drinking cyanide, which did nothing to slow the process of decay. By the time the US military personnel arrived, bodies were in advanced states of decomposition. When Time asked civilian responder Patricia Edwards about her most enduring memories of Jonestown, she replied, "The stench. I will never forget the stench." Jones heavily abused drugs, notably amphetamines and sleeping pills. He scored by using his followers' prescriptions or persuading sympathetic healthcare workers to smuggle pills for him. Ironically, People's Temple members were forbidden from recreational drug use. After the tragedy, a massive stockpile of drugs was recovered from the commune's warehouse, including, according to the New York Times, 11,000 doses of Thorazine. There were no records or other clues as to who was getting these drugs.
There were beatings. People were abused and belittled, and many were drugged toward the end.
By the time the drugs were recovered, investigators knew that Jones had used them to sedate and control church members who wanted to leave. Perhaps the most disturbing record of the Jonestown Massacre is the so-called death tape, a recording of Jones's final words to his congregation as they died around him. Jones manipulates the crowd to do his bidding, as a few People's Temple members try to escape and hundreds around them die excruciating deaths.
Lay down your life with dignity. Don't lay down with tears and agony.
The tape may have been intentionally left behind as a record of what Jones called an act of revolutionary suicide, protesting the conditions of an inhumane world. According to Rolling Stone, only 2 goodbye letters were recovered. One was unsigned, but attributed to commune teacher Richard Tropp. In his final message, he falsely absolves Jones of blame for the murder of Congressman Ryan and tries to paint the mass death as idyllic.
I can't help but say that none of this would have been possible had it not been for Jim Jones.
Not everyone who survived Jonestown is convinced Tropp wrote that letter, though. One of the survivors, Tim Carter, told Rolling Stone that he saw Tropp arguing against Jones's planned suicide up until the last minute. He told the outlet, "The words that were in that seemed very peaceful and very accepting and very kind of pro-everybody dying. That's not where Dick was coming from." Investigators quickly pushed back against the idea that Jonestown was a mass suicide. Guyanese authorities told the New York Times that they estimated only 200 of the 911 victims willingly drank the cyanide-laced flavor aid, and survivors have often described Jonestown as a mass murder. In fact, armed guards surrounded the congregation, preventing anyone from escaping with their lives, and the children who couldn't have understood or consented to what they were doing were killed first.
These people never had a chance. They had been victims of racism, they were victims of poverty.
Nevertheless, at least one survivor, Odell Rhodes, told authorities that, at first, most people took the cyanide willingly, and that it was only when people began to die that the remaining church members were forced to drink at gunpoint. But syringes were found during the recovery process, and several bodies had injection marks, suggesting that at least some victims were injected with poison rather than willingly drinking it. Out of the nearly 1,000 people Jones brought to Jonestown, only 85 survived the massacre. Jones's son Stephen survived because he was away playing basketball, and that day Jones sent 3 men to the Soviet embassy with millions in cash and gold, inadvertently sparing their lives. Others, like Larry Layton, were at the airstrip engaged in a deadly gun battle with Congressman Ryan's delegation. In fact, Layton was the only person tried and convicted for the Jonestown deaths. A small handful of survivors simply ran for it, including 22-year-old Leslie Wagner Wilson and her son. She expected to be shot at any second.
Everyone can look up and see us walking. And I was just shaken. I was so frightened.
Catherine Hyacinth Thrash hid under her bed in the infirmary, telling Indy Star, "I remember those babies marching past our place with little paper hats on, wearing sandals, sunsuits, and matching shorts and tops. It's enough to make you scream your lungs out, thinking of those babies dead." And finally, Grover Cleveland Davis, who was hard of hearing, slept through the whole thing. He later came out of his hut to find everyone either dead or disappeared.